This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. Frank Furness was the founder of the so-called Philadelphia School of Architecture. He was born in 1839. He was the son of a prominent Unitarian minister, and he died in 1912. His most famous works include the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, the Fisher Fine Arts Library at Penn, as well as numerous mansions and hotels and train stations in the Philadelphia area. Frank Furness was not formally trained as an architect in the modern sense. When he came of age in the 1860s, there were no formal architecture schools. It wasn't until the 1880s and 1890s that schools such as the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and MIT founded architecture undergraduate and graduate programs. And Frank Furness apprenticed himself to the architect Richard Morris Hunt, who was the first American trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. But as much as Furness learned under Hunt's tutelage, the defining event for Frank Furness's life came when he was a young man between 1861 and 1865 when he served in the Union Army as a cavalry officer. And the violence he saw there and the suffering really imprinted itself in his mind. And I think it gave Frank Furness a sense of you only live once, you might as well live boldly. And like Frank Lloyd Wright, Frank Furness was a master of theater. He turned himself into a brand. Furness's dress, his demeanor was extremely theatrical and loud. He wore very loud plaid clothing. He spoke with lots of curses and really openly and flagrantly violated a lot of the sort of Victorian primness that he saw around him in Philadelphia. Apparently, he said his dream was to stand on the stage of Philadelphia's Academy of Music with an audience of all of his clients and telling them to go to hell. But that being said, his bold architecture, which was a blend of historicism and modernism avant-garde, really attracted the interest of Philadelphia's richest and most powerful people, most notably the Pennsylvania Railroad, which commissioned him to build their Broad Street terminal, among other things. And Furness also inspired a whole generation of protégés, most notably the young architect Louis Sullivan, who studied under him. And Louis Sullivan was just so captivated by this brash, bold man that he called him affectionately the Dog Man. Furness was someone who was not known to be very physically attractive. He had a very kind of bulldogish face, but he was not ashamed of that. And Louis Sullivan said, I found myself under the absolute spell of the Dog Man. And Furness faced a problem that a lot of architects faced back then and today, that he consorted with very wealthy people and designed their homes, designed train stations, designed corporate buildings, but he never really had the means himself to build a dream house, one that really reflected his full potential, an architect's residence. Unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, who begged, borrowed, and stole to build Taliesin, not once, but 3 times, and was constantly in debt, Furness lived relatively conservatively and within his means. His brother, the Shakespeare scholar Horace Furness, married into a substantial amount of money, and that branch of the Furness family provided a lot of patronage for him and an entree into Philadelphia society. But Furness himself lived relatively modestly. He purchased a townhouse, he and his wife, at 711 Locust Street. And this house was in an area that had once been fashionable, but by the 1880s and 1890s had been surpassed by Rittenhouse Square to the west. But to the best of his ability, Frank Furness used this house as a showcase for his brand, his personality, and he entertained a lot of people here. And there was a contradiction because his father, William Henry Furness, the minister of Philadelphia's First Unitarian Church, had complained about houses of this type, the sort of Quaker plain brick row house. Frank Furness actually grew up in a house similar to the one he bought as an adult. But inside, Frank Furness was able to transform this place, this plain row house, into a palace of his own imagination. I actually think that a lot of Furness's inspiration to become an architect came from his father, who encouraged him in Emersonian fashion to go forth and pursue his dreams. Furness himself, the Reverend Furness, complained that the so-called Quaker style, marble steps and wooden shutters, was boring. Exuberant ornamentation was not only anathema to Philadelphia taste, but it was also expensive, even in the Victorian era of cheap labor. Reverend Furness raised his own family in a plain but substantial Quaker style. I actually think this is very relevant today, this discussion between minimalism and maximalism, because over the past 20 years or so, in current architecture and design parlance, there's been this obsession with plain white, simple surfaces, and minimalism. And in this post-COVID era, it seems like we're swinging back towards a more Furnessian view of homes and design, of maximalism. And this back and forth between minimalism and maximalism is something that is not new. It's true today and also true in Furness's time. Frank Furness broke the mold of Philadelphia's sober and conservative architectural language, designing buildings in an aggressive, flamboyant style that still captures our imagination. A fine Frank Furness building, such as the University of Pennsylvania's library and the First Unitarian Church, built for his father's congregation, shouted, "Look at me," in defiance of all Quaker modesty. However, when it came to his own house, Frank Furness found himself in the same budgetary dilemma as his minister father. Although he rubbed elbows with some of Philadelphia's richest families, he and his wife Fanny could not afford to build a showcase house for themselves of Furness's own design. His architecture practice, although financially successful for the last quarter of the 19th century, simply did not bring in enough money for him to travel in the Rittenhouse Square set. So he and his wife did the next best thing, purchasing a proper 4-story townhouse in the Washington Square neighborhood, which was still respectable but had fallen in status somewhat since the Civil War. It was still safely between the acceptable boundaries of Market and Pine Streets, a calling card detail to which Furness's client base would have paid attention. If Furness's house at 711 Locust Street was Quaker plain on the outside, the architect made the interior a glittering showcase of his own design skill. Yet it was in the smoking room that really caught the attention of the visitors. If they were allowed into Furness's inner sanctum, or in modern parlance, his man cave, the smoking room at 711 Locust Street looked as if it had been plucked from a Rocky Mountain hunting cabin and dropped right into Center City, Philadelphia. It was filled with Native American art and textiles, pelts, unframed prints, antlers, and guns that Furness had purchased on his frequent trips out west. Like his fellow proper Philadelphian creative type Owen Wister, he was fascinated with the ethos and mythos of the American West. Here, in his rustic one-room addition that he built with his own hands, he would entertain his comrades from his Civil War cavalry regiment, as well as John Foster Kirk of Lippincott's Monthly and the poet Walt Whitman. In the early 1880s, the publisher D. Appleton and Company released Artistic Houses, a lavish book that featured interior photographs of some of the grandest homes in the United States, including several in Philadelphia. They were built by tycoons such as William Henry Vanderbilt, Louis Comfort Tiffany, and Marshall Field. Yet there was only one featured photograph of the inside of an architect's home, the smoking room at 711 Locust Street. The editors of Artistic Houses wrote of this space, "What Mr. Furness has really achieved from a chromatic point of view can barely be surmised from our reproduction in black and white. But those who have seen the interior of this cozy little sanctum will agree that, in the felicity of arrangement both of lines and tones, it is artistic to a high degree, while its literary interest, if we must express ourselves, is absolutely unique." Frank Furness's good fortune, an endless flow of commissions and long evenings with bohemian friends in the smoking room did not last. By the early 1900s, his vibrant, bold architecture of Furness and Evans was woefully out of date, and he fell on hard times. He moved out to Media to be near his beloved brother Horace and other extended family, and he died in 1912. His Locust Street townhouse with its famous smoking room is now a distant memory. Much of Frank Furness's architectural legacy was demolished in the early to mid 20th century. There are some survivors of his really flamboyant and wonderful architecture that in many ways anticipates Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan and Louis Kahn and others of the Philadelphia and American modern movement. But Frank Furness's interior life still remains somewhat of a mystery, but we can get a glimpse of his private life, his creative life, outside of his architecture studio and outside of his drafting room, in images of this private space where he would unwind and interact with other creative people, such as Walt Whitman. And the conversations and this room itself are lost, but it is a reminder that great artists like Frank Furness exist not just as creators, but also as conversationalists and thinkers who have to interact with other people of similar mindsets. And this space that he created, the smoking room of his townhouse at 711 Locust Street, was his own little private theater. This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.